He sat alone at the defense table, the epitome of quiet strength in a world that often overlooked him. No briefcase, no tie, just an old green jacket that had seen better days, and a manila folder held flat between his hands, as though it was the only thing left to hold on to. He hadn't uttered a single word since the session had begun. Around him, the usual sounds of the courtroom swirled, lawyers arguing, the judge flipping through papers, the shuffle of feet on the polished floors. Yet, he remained still, a silent figure in the midst of it all. Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to surprise everyone? If you believe in powerful, raw stories like these, subscribe and help us share the quiet legends among us, capable of extraordinary feats. Across from him, the attorney couldn't hide his smirk. Every so often, he glanced over at Harold, as though watching a slow-motion collapse. The judge, with her well-practiced impatience, glanced over her glasses, tapping her pen against the desk. The warmth in the room seemed to suffocate the air, a stifling feeling that made the crowd restless, eager to move on. And then came the chuckles from the back, mocking laughs as Harold mispronounced a legal term, a small mistake that seemed to seal their judgment of him. The attorney didn't hold back. He called Harold incoherent, claimed that he would waste the court's time. He boldly declared that Harold wasn't mentally fit to represent himself, as though Harold wasn't sitting there with more life experience than any of them. But Harold didn't react. He didn't flinch. He just waited, his hands gripping the manila folder a little tighter, waiting for the moment when it would finally be his turn to speak. And when that moment came, Harold stood. He didn't rush, didn't fumble. He walked to the witness stand slowly, purposefully, without notes or preparation. His movements were steady, deliberate, as though every step mattered more than what anyone else thought. Then, he placed two items on the polished wood of the witness stand, a tarnished silver star and a letter, an old letter that was signed not by a neighbor, not by a lawyer, but by an active duty general still in uniform. The room fell into an eerie silence. The laughter stopped. The attorney's smirk faded. No one dared to make a sound. Harold's silence spoke volumes, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom realized just how wrong they had been about him. So, what happened next? What did Harold do that made the courtroom fall so still? How did a man so dismissed by the system manage to turn the tide without ever raising his voice? And why is this story so important? Why should we share it? Because stories like Harold's, raw, real, and powerful, deserve to be heard. Harold Evans had lived in that apartment building for 17 years, quietly, methodically. His life had been simple, he always paid his rent by check, always on time, never missed a payment. But things changed last spring when his rent shot up by $500 with no warning. For someone living on a fixed income, that was a blow he couldn't absorb. The property had changed hands twice in 6 months, each new owner with new policies, new rules, but none of them cared about the things that mattered. The water-stained ceiling, the faulty radiator, the cracked step on the third-floor stairwell, Harold had stopped reporting those things years ago because no one listened. But that letter, that hand-delivered summons taped to his door, he knew what it meant the moment he saw it. Harold peeled it from the door with steady hands and sat at the kitchen table, a table where, just a few years ago, he had sat with his wife, playing dominoes. The apartment, now silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the hum of an ancient fridge, felt like a tomb. He opened the letter and read it slowly, taking in each word, each line. Eviction hearing. Failure to pay. Self-representation. The date was set for Thursday at 9:30 a.m. There was no point in calling anyone. No lawyer. No children. No friends who hadn't already slipped into silence or faded into memory. No one would answer the phone. So, Harold didn't panic. He simply reached for an old folder, yellowed from time, sitting on the shelf above the refrigerator. Inside, it held the weight of everything that mattered to him, his DD-214, 2 commendation letters, a black and white photo of his unit in Fallujah, and a medal he hadn't touched in years. He laid them out on the table, one by one, like evidence in a case that no one had ever bothered to listen to. That night, Harold polished his boots, not because anyone in the courtroom would notice, but because it mattered to him. He pressed his shirt with the back of a spoon heated over the stove. Small things. Details. They mattered. The next morning, with his folder under his arm, Harold didn't rehearse a speech. He didn't make notes. He simply nodded once to the empty room and locked the door behind him. By 9:20, he was standing in line at security, 1 foot sore from the walk, his hands loose at his sides, shoulders straight. He wasn't there to win. He was there to be heard. The courtroom was colder than expected. Harold adjusted his collar as he entered, scanning the room with a quiet, methodical precision, like a man assessing a battlefield. He wasn't early, but he wasn't late either. The benches were half filled with tenants, landlords, and people waiting for their own cases. At the front, the plaintiff's table was already occupied by a young man in a tailored gray suit, legs crossed, looking confident, comfortable, and completely out of place in this setting. He didn't look up when Harold entered. He didn't need to. The court clerk called the next case, and Harold stepped forward, his voice steady as he gave his name. He passed through the gate and took his seat. No one offered him help. No one offered him a hand, a word of support. The judge was flipping through her file, not looking at him, not acknowledging him. When she asked the attorney to present his case, the young man stood with a practiced rhythm, almost rehearsed, speaking in the indifferent tone of someone who had done this hundreds of times. "This is a straightforward eviction," the attorney said, his voice smooth and practiced. "My client, the building's current owner, has attempted multiple times to secure payment from the defendant. There has been no substantial payment in over 90 days. We are seeking immediate possession of the property." He leaned forward slightly, clicking his pen with a nonchalant gesture. "The defendant has opted to represent himself today. While I appreciate his presence, I'd like the court to note that he is unrepresented, unprepared, and appears to be reading from outdated information. We believe any testimony offered without legal support is both incoherent and procedurally irrelevant." Harold didn't react. He sat there, his hands folded over the folder on his lap, eyes fixed ahead, face unreadable. The judge nodded once, scribbling something in the margin of her file. The attorney sat back down, crossing his arms, his eyes flicking briefly to Harold, a dismissive glance. This wasn't a man, after all, but just an obstacle in his path. When the judge asked Harold if he had anything to submit to the court, Harold didn't speak right away. He opened the folder carefully, as if the paper inside could break, could bruise. He pulled out a single page and handed it to the bailiff without a word. The bailiff took it to the judge. She glanced down at the paper, her brow tightening as she read it, her eyes lifting to Harold, but still, no words. The room seemed to slow. The judge stared at the letter longer than expected. At first, her pen continued its scribbling, the usual habit of bureaucracy, but slowly, the motion stopped. Her brow softened, then tightened again. She read it once more, slower this time. She looked up, not at Harold, but at the attorney, who was still distracted by his phone. The judge placed the paper on the bench gently, and suddenly, the energy in the room had shifted. The clerk glanced nervously at the judge, unsure whether to continue. The bailiff, who had barely acknowledged Harold, was now watching him closely, his gaze shifting from the letter to Harold and back again. Something didn't fit. The judge cleared her throat, her voice steady and measured as she read aloud from the letter. "This letter, entered into the record by Mr. Evans, is a commendation from Major General Charles D. Harland, dated April 12, 2005, acknowledging extraordinary service during an active combat operation in Al-Anbar province. It references the preservation of civilian lives under direct enemy fire and cites a tactical decision that, and I quote, likely prevented the loss of an entire Marine unit." She paused, looking at Harold, then back at the attorney. "This is not irrelevant." The attorney's confident posture faltered. His smile flickered, and he uncrossed his arms. "Your Honor," He began, "While we respect Mr. Evans's military service, we would argue that personal history, however honorable, has no bearing on the matter of rent." Harold didn't respond. He didn't blink. He didn't move a muscle. The judge raised a hand, her voice firm, unyielding. "It has bearing," she said, her eyes never leaving the attorney. "When a man who wore the uniform for this country stands alone in this courtroom with no counsel and the opposing party refers to him as incoherent, it has bearing." No one laughed. No one mocked him now. The room, which had dismissed him so easily just moments before, was shifting. The gallery was growing still, the murmurs fading, the sense of unease settling in. The judge looked down at the letter once more, then asked, almost gently, "Mr. Evans, do you have anything else to present to the court?" Harold nodded slowly, reached into the folder again, and carefully pulled out something small, wrapped in soft cloth. He placed it gently on the table, unwrapping it with great care, as though the act itself held immense meaning. When the silver star gleamed under the courtroom lights, no one looked away. The entire room was transfixed. That small, tarnished piece of metal, the same metal he hadn't touched in years, spoke volumes more than any lawyer could. The silver star gleamed softly under the courtroom lights. It wasn't polished to a perfect shine like those displayed in glass cases for all to admire. No, this one had wear, age, and a kind of softness to its edges that told a story of battles fought long ago. It had been carried in the field, tucked away into the folds of a soldier's uniform, and perhaps, in those moments of quiet reflection, it was the only thing that offered a sense of comfort, of purpose. Harold didn't need to explain why he brought it with him. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. Without a word, he unwrapped the cloth, revealing the silver star for all to see. He placed it gently on the table, then slowly slid it across the wood towards the center of the room. It stopped midway between himself and the judge, resting there for all to witness. For a moment, there was absolute stillness. The courtroom, usually filled with the hum of voices, the tapping of pens, and the shifting of feet, was suddenly silent. The court clerk stopped typing. The bailiff, once shifting his weight impatiently from one foot to the other, froze. The people in the back rose, those who had come for something as mundane as a neighbor's traffic violation or a landlord's payment dispute, leaned forward ever so slightly, drawn to the weight of something they couldn't quite name, yet something that seemed to matter more than all the paperwork and rules in that room. The judge lowered her pen, her eyes scanning the tarnished metal before her. She looked at it as if seeing it for the very first time. The attorney across the aisle, whose arrogance had been on full display moments before, stopped his quiet drumming of his fingers on the folder in front of him. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering between the metal and Harold, his mind clearly trying to calculate something that simply wouldn't add up. Harold didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence in the room was loud enough. Finally, the judge broke the silence, but her voice had changed. Gone was the detached, procedural tone. Instead, she spoke with a softness that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Evans, may I ask why you brought this with you?" Harold met her gaze directly. His voice didn't waver. It wasn't filled with anger or resentment, there was no need for that. It was simply steady, grounded, the voice of a man who had lived a life and knew exactly when to speak and when to remain silent. "Because people forget, ma'am. And I wanted to make sure at least one person in this room remembered." He didn't point to the attorney, didn't make any grand gestures. He simply looked at the judge, allowing the weight of his words to hang in the air. The attorney, who had once been so dismissive, now found himself at a loss for words. The judge turned her attention to him, her gaze firm but not unkind. "Counselor, I would suggest you reconsider your posture in this case." The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the door, his mind likely calculating how to salvage whatever shred of dignity he had left. Slowly, he closed his folder, stood up, and without so much as a word of thanks or acknowledgement, he walked out of the courtroom. As the door clicked shut behind him, something remarkable happened. Without anyone prompting them, without any instructions from the judge, the courtroom began to murmur. It wasn't confusion, and it certainly wasn't shock. It was something else. It was a quiet kind of applause, not for a victory, but for something far deeper. Something sacred had just been acknowledged. And while the applause wasn't loud or celebratory, it spread across the room in a ripple, starting with a man in the second row, then a woman near the aisle, and then slowly, almost reverently, it spread to the rest of the courtroom. Some didn't clap at all, but they didn't need to. Their posture had shifted from passive to present. They were no longer merely spectators. They had been transformed into witnesses. Harold, however, didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't reach for the medal or the letter again. Instead, he stood up slowly, with the same care he had taken when he first unwrapped the silver star. He gathered the cloth and rewrapped the medal, sliding it back into the folder as if it were something deeply private again. He secured the rubber band around it, tucking the folder under his arm. And then, with a slow but deliberate step, he turned toward the exit. The bailiff, who had barely noticed Harold before, stepped aside, not out of duty, but out of respect. The judge said nothing, but her eyes followed Harold all the way to the back of the room. There was no ruling. No sentence. No further words were needed. The moment the truth was laid bare, the proceedings had ended. As Harold passed the gallery, people instinctively made space for him. Some glanced down, perhaps out of respect, while others simply nodded. One woman pressed her hand to her chest as he passed by, but no one reached out to him. They knew better than to disturb what had just transpired. The heavy courthouse door creaked open, letting in a draft of sunlight from the corridor. Harold stepped into it and kept walking, his pace steady, neither slow nor hurried. He wasn't in a rush. He had nothing left to prove. He had done what needed to be done, and now, the world could keep moving, but he would remain unfazed. Behind him, the courtroom lingered in a silence that stretched far longer than a few moments. After a few seconds, the normal rhythm of legal proceedings resumed, papers shuffled, voices rose, new cases were called. But the space Harold had just left behind hadn't forgotten him. No one who had witnessed his quiet strength would forget him. Not for a long time. Outside, the bench sat half in shadow, half in sunlight. The metal seat had warmed in the light, and Harold sat down without hesitation. His hands rested on the manila folder across his lap, and he stared ahead, lost in his own thoughts. The city moved around him, indifferent, horns honked, footsteps echoed on concrete, voices passed by without pause. But Harold didn't notice. He wasn't focused on the chaos of the world around him. His eyes were fixed ahead, not on anything specific, but simply forward. It was the gaze of a man who had learned long ago to focus on the next step rather than the noise between. He didn't look any different from any other tired old man sitting on a bus bench. His uniform was gone. His medals were tucked away, carefully hidden in a worn folder. The courtroom, that chapter of his life, had closed behind him. But something in his posture had shifted. There was a subtle change in the way he sat now. It wasn't a waiting posture, it was the posture of someone who had done something that needed to be done, and now, he could rest. A bus pulled up, but Harold didn't stand. It wasn't his bus. The driver gave him a brief glance through the glass and then drove on, without a second thought. A young woman sat beside him for a moment, but then shifted uncomfortably when she noticed the folder. She didn't ask him what it was. She didn't need to. From inside his coat, Harold pulled out the letter once again. Not to reread it, not to show it off to anyone, but just to feel the paper. His fingers traced the signature at the bottom, the one that mattered to him more than anything that had been said that day. With a slow and deliberate motion, he folded it carefully, slid it back into place, and sat still for another 10 minutes, letting the weight of the moment settle. He finally rose, with quiet effort, and crossed the street without any rush. The tree overhead had shed half of its leaves, and they crunched under his boots. He didn't speak to anyone, but as he walked down the block, a man sitting on a nearby bench stood briefly, gave Harold a slight nod, and then sat back down. Harold acknowledged him with a small, subtle nod, never breaking stride. At the corner, a small plaque sat mounted on a brick wall, weathered and half covered in grime. It read, "To those who served, to those who still stand." Harold didn't stop to read it, he already knew what it said. But he paused for just a moment, looking at it long enough to remember what it meant, and then he turned and kept walking. Some medals aren't worn. They're carried quietly, folded into old cloth, tucked away in drawers, resting between letters that no one reads anymore. Not because the medals have lost their meaning, but because the world has forgotten to ask what they ever meant in the first place. Harold Evans didn't walk into that courtroom to fight. He walked in to remind, not with anger, not with a lawyer, but with the only tools he had left, memory, dignity, and a piece of silver earned in a place no one in that courtroom had ever been. They laughed at him at first, thinking they understood his story: another tenant, another delay, another man too proud to ask for help. What they didn't see, until the truth was laid out in front of them, was the depth of what Harold carried with him. That silver star didn't win him the case. It simply made everyone realize the kind of man they had been trying to erase. In a world obsessed with titles, credentials, and sharp suits, Harold reminded everyone in that room that true authority doesn't come from volume or force. Sometimes, it comes from the quiet strength of an old man who sits, waits, and when it's his turn to speak, he doesn't raise his voice. He raises the truth. The courtroom didn't applaud because Harold won. They clapped because they realized how long it had taken them to recognize who he was. And perhaps that's what stories like Harold's are really about: not victory, but visibility. Not power, but presence. How many veterans, like Harold, walk through life overlooked, underestimated, spoken over? How many carry medals they never mention, commendations they never show, trauma they never voice? How many have fought for a country that doesn't even see them waiting at the bus stop? You may never meet someone like Harold Evans, or maybe you already have, and you didn't realize who they were. In a world where everything seems to be measured by titles, appearances, and achievements, stories like Harold's remind us of the profound truth that real worth isn't always visible at first glance. Too often, we overlook the quiet strength and dignity in those who don't flaunt their accomplishments or wear their medals on their sleeves. The way society sometimes ignores veterans, the elderly, or even those who've quietly carried burdens too heavy for most of us to fathom, is a reflection of how deeply we've become obsessed with surface-level validation. Harold didn't walk into that courtroom to win. He didn't need to. What he carried with him, his past, his sacrifice, and his humility, spoke louder than any polished argument could. It's heartbreaking that so many people, often without realizing it, dismiss those who've quietly served their purpose, simply because they don't fit the mold of success that society celebrates. But Harold's quiet act, the way he made everyone in that room pause and reflect on what really matters, should be a wake-up call. We should all learn to stop measuring people by the noise they make or the titles they hold. It's time to focus on presence over perfection, truth over appearances. True respect isn't about the accolades. It's about recognizing the strength in silence and giving those who don't demand attention the respect they've long earned. So before this story ends, I want to ask you one simple question: where are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments, not for numbers, not for clicks, but because stories like this, when shared, make the invisible visible. And if this story moved you, made you pause, made you feel, then don't just keep scrolling. Subscribe, share, and help us keep these voices alive. We chase the truth behind the forgotten faces, the ones who were never meant to be forgotten.